Welcome to Talking Books, a podcast about the most important books of the day from the people who bring you Talking Feds. I'm Harry Littman. Those of you who followed us are used to on this franchise are talking about some very important sort of current events book, canvassing the political and legal scenes, maybe even a little broader about the ideas. Today we're doing something broader still. I would say much broader still. We're talking about life, or in particular, The Good Life, a book that based on a remarkable, long-standing study of people throughout the life cycle, beginning in their late teenage years. And we have, very fortunately, one of the authors here with us, Marc Schultz. Marc, thanks so much for being here. Marc is a clinical psychologist. He's the associate director of the Harvard Study of Adult Development, on which the book is based. And his research focus is emotion and relation dynamics. But more importantly, we're going to be talking about the study, which you guys may have heard of because it's really made a lot of noise, I think. So anyway, first of all, thanks very much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be with you, Harry.
Okay, so the study itself, it really is remarkable and one of a kind. It put me in mind of the 7-Up movies and the kind of, fascination and irreplaceable, engrossing feel of a real life experience over time. And another reason it did is because that 7-Up started with this sort of sociological goal of comparisons of, the two sort of stratums in very class-based England. And this itself, yes, can you tell us about the study, but including its sort of origins?
Yeah, so it is, as you suggest, it's really a remarkable study that started long before I'd been involved in it. It started in the 1930s, so it was in the late era of the Depression, on the eve of World War II. And it started with two very different groups of young men or boys. 2/3 of the original sample, the total sample is 724 participants. 2/3 were boys that were growing up in some of the poorest neighborhoods in Boston, facing real challenges. Most of them came from immigrant families, lived in tenement buildings, very crowded conditions without running water. So facing real economic deprivation and challenge. The remaining 1/3 literally lived across the city in Cambridge. They were Harvard University students. They were picked to be part of the study when they were sophomores. Both groups, these were initially different studies, but in both cohorts, there was an interest in trying to understand what led to human flourishing, which was very unusual in the late 30s, early positive psychology, if you will.
Right. I mean, the story that one hears is it wasn't until the last 20 years or so and Seligman and Penn that positive psychology even became a sort of thing. But this was ahead of its time, yeah.
Yeah, and I think it really was very unusual. So in the inner city cohort, they were interested in how these boys might be able to survive and thrive despite the many challenges that they were facing. And the college cohort, there was an interest in trying to understand how people develop well. And they thought Harvard men were going to be a good group to follow, normal group. So that's what they started with. Both cohorts have been followed throughout their entire lives, as you've suggested, very closely. In the beginning, we made visits to the homes, interviewed the parents, watched them interact with their parents, very close physical and medical exams throughout the study, lots of questionnaires, lots of interviews. The study was very interested, as the 7-Up movies, very interested in the kind of inner life of participants. We just had a larger sample along the way and used more rigorous methods. And along the way, we also incorporated the wives of the original participants. And more recently, we're working with 1,300 of the children of the original participants. So that's
Now,
the study.
I hadn't realized actually that the two cohorts were separate at first. So the two studies, when did they braid together? But I guess initially then it wasn't done with an idea of kind of contrasting and comparing the less privileged and more privileged cohorts?
No, that was really the brilliance of folks that were leading the study later on to bring the two studies together. Initially, each had their own separate focus in different parts of that kind of socioeconomic strata, but they were separate studies. The study of the Harvard men was run out of the Harvard Health Center, again, with this interest in trying to understand normal or healthy development. And the other study with the inner city boys was actually run out of the law school by a husband and wife team, the Glucks, and they were interested in delinquency. And the cohort that we include were actually the normal comparison sample to the delinquent sample that they were following.
I got it. And now I know this remains challenging to the present day, though they've made it much more precise. But back in the 30s, there was an interest in flourishing. What were the metrics that were applied to measure it at the time? I know current studies both try to check sort of instantaneous mood, but also sense of satisfaction longitudinally.
Exactly.
But I know that's developed over time. What were the original ways of trying to assess this?
Well, it's really interesting historically to look back. So in the 30s, of course, we didn't know as much as we know now, and technologies were different. So the kinds of assessments included some things that we would think about as quite weird and strange at this time. So they were interested, for example, in the shape of people's heads, the physiognomy of the
Wow.
head, and thought that that was related to personality and the possibility it could be related to thriving.
So
They had a
what the first people came in and had the whole like caliper treatment?
Exactly. They were measured very carefully. Their bodies were measured, and their
Yeah,
body types were rated. So there were a lot of sort of, to us, very curious ideas, and probably ideas that don't have any merit. But during the 30s, this was right before the eve of World War II. So there was
I
an
mean, the
interest in
Nazis did exactly this, actually.
Exactly. And there was
Yeah.
some of that idea in the United States as well. So those were examples of some of the more unusual measures, but they always included interviews and questionnaires. And in the interviews back in the 30s, what they were interested in is trying to understand personality and the way people approach challenges in their life. Later on, the study became well known for thinking about the idea of defenses and how people survived challenges and navigated what we would now call stressors and their coping strategies. So the methods evolved over time, but there's lots of carefully rated by psychiatrists or psychologists, sometimes social workers, carefully constructed sort of overviews of people's functioning in both of the cohorts. And of course, in the inner city cohort, they were interested in behavioral outcomes like whether the kids were staying in school and staying out of trouble. So there are lots of those indicators as well of human flourishing.
Okay, I mean, this part of it is fascinating, and I'd like to go on for a while, but we should fast forward. So now, at least you've settled on a kind of a word that you're measured in the good life, a Greek word. So that I'll go back to my dust off my early philosophy. But so I think we're talking about the way you've put it is eudaimonia. We all have to learn that 5-syllable Greek word in what is otherwise a very, very accessible book. But just if you would describe the general metric you're going for and trying to measure among, throughout the lives, and particularly in the, as people get older.
So the study is a long study and a rich study. So there are lots and lots of measures, but one of the consistent themes has been this focus on well-being. And well-being has, I think you alluded to it earlier, really has two components that we think about. One is the kind of momentary experience of joy and pleasure, that lovely feeling that we love to get, but it's a fleeting feeling. So it's ephemeral and it's fleeting, and we can't experience that all the time. A more sustained thing, which is a kind of combination of attitudes and a kind of construction of the way the world is working, is your sense of meaning or your sense of satisfaction with life. And that's closer to this sort of Greek idea of eudaimonia. So it's a kind of sense that life has meaning and purpose, and it's not just about those momentary emotions. And both of those things together are how psychologists in the modern era think about well-being and happiness. It's part of how we measure it in the world happiness reports and comparisons across countries. So those are the types of constructs that we're after, and we can ask people about it, but we can also, and we do, observe their behavior, observe how quickly they can recover from stressors in the lab, for example. So there are a number of ways that we try and get out these constructs.
And you make it clear, by the way, that it's something quite different from just feeling up all the time. On the contrary, you pretty much emphasize that a a good life, if there's one, implicit here, is a hard one, is a challenging one, is one that goes, up and down. You anticipated just where I was going on this methodological question, which is, I assume that you have to regard with some suspicion people's recordations of their own sense of satisfaction. Like I was a Harvard undergrad, and my peers were just so used to getting A's and pleasing people that I think you field that question and you think, oh, I got to show I'm a good grade earner. That means I'm satisfied even if I'm not. So how do you mentioned stressors in the lab, maybe you can explain that a little more, but how do you get behind that to an actual, to what extent can you, and how do you get behind that to an actual measure of people's genuine serenity, or whatever word you would use for this second cohort of happiness?
So you're raising just an important question that I think continues to challenge any behavioral scientist, but particularly psychology. And what I want to say is that we don't want to dismiss self-reports, that if I'm interested in how happy you are, probably I want to ask you how happy you are. But I also want to be skeptical and critical and think about, is there a way to triangulate that? So can I also look at your expression? Can I ask a close friend of yours or a partner how happy Harry is? So in our study, what we try to do is a method of triangulation. We try and get at this from multiple perspectives. Physiology might be another indicator, particularly when it comes to kind of equilibrium or equanimity that we might be after. So the modern strategy is really to use multiple methods to get at a construct like peacefulness or happiness. But I do want to emphasize that people self-report. The example that you chose of the Harvard students, we have Harvard students originally in the sample. One of the strategies we use is we follow people across time. So that takes care of that bias in some ways. So we might be interested in when a particular individual is at his or her most happy point in her life. And that controls for some of those weird biases that come in because of who people are, or their sense of status or privilege or culture and all of those things. So you asked about the stressor. We do, this is one of the things we do to folks, a kind of controlled circumstance. We bring them into the lab with consent. They have an idea of what's going to happen. But we give them the most common stressor that all of us face, which is public speaking. And we do it under conditions in which we imply that there's going to be lots of judgment, that you're applying for a job, you're going to make a pitch about, about why you're qualified for this job. Behind this one-way mirror, right? Well, I'm making you more and more stressed, right? Behind this one-way mirror is a bunch of judges. We're recording this. You'll get feedback when you're done. And most of us get stressed out in that circumstance. If that doesn't work, we also try very complicated mathematical, subtraction from 2,421 by 17. Harry, you're not going fast enough. Can you go? So people get stressed is what happens. And what we're interested in is not just how reactive they are, but more importantly, how quickly they can recover, both emotionally and also in their physiology. Again, that's not self-report. We're monitoring their heart rate and their blood pressure. So that's an example of another measure where we go beyond self-report.
That's really ingenious. I mean, I've heard about these experiments where your hand is plunged in cold water.
In water.
That's a much more sort of everyday experience. You mentioned, reports over time, and I think that was a kind of balancing out factor. So presumably these were as detailed and voluminous throughout the life cycle, but you chose to include in the book some very interesting and longer accounts of people in their 70s when, whether they were fessing up or had just become wiser, it was quite clear. And I guess I should cut to the chase of the big life lesson of the book. But they had learned that whatever their early ambitions about money or fame and the like, they were much more open about assessing their own happiness or unhappiness, and describing the importance of, in a word, relationships. So that's a tough compound question for you, Mark, but I want to both ask you a little about the vantage point of the older people, but then to introduce what, if there's a single motto in a book called The Good Life, what it is, and then we
There
can
is
explore that
there is
further.
a single motto, and it's
Yeah.
simple. I mean, it's amazing as we started to work on this book and think about what we wanted to communicate. And we were interested in trying to reach a broader audience than the audience that typically reads articles and
Yeah.
journals. We've published hundreds of articles from the study over the years, but we really wanted to get this information out to people in a way that they could use it. And when we looked at hundreds of findings from our study, and we looked beyond our study, because good science looks at multiple studies that confirm the same finding, what we found is simple. Relationships keep us happier and healthier throughout the lifespan. It's all kinds
And
of
vice versa, right?
the absence of relationships is pernicious for our health. It has serious connections to health problems and people living less, so to dying earlier. So it's all types of relationships, and we can unpack that. But that's the simple message that we arrived at. I think you were
Let's
thinking,
unpack that. I'm
yeah,
sorry to interrupt, but one quick
yeah,
thing before we unpack it more, which is that comes, maybe not now in the modern day, and people, who have read this more, but that's a surprise to most of the people in the cohort. One of the things you have that are pretty valuable is an initial interviews where there really is quite a lot of what are you looking for, what will make you happy, and I think money came first, maybe fame second. But a point you make, and others have made it too. Kahneman, I'm thinking of in particular, who was in this
mhm,
series, we're really bad at predicting, knowing, appreciating our own happiness. That's a kind of a frustrating and in some ways surprising fact. Can you just talk about that a little,
yeah,
including why it is?
yeah. So this is the realm of what we call affective forecasting, trying to
Yeah,
predict what's going to make us happy. And this work goes a lot to Danny Kahneman's work about the basic irrationalities that we build into lots of our decisions that we
yeah.
make. But we tend to, the basic idea here is that when we think about our potential connections with others and putting ourselves out there, we pay more attention often to the potential negative consequences. So someone may reject me or think that I'm being silly or that I'm uncool or something like that. And we focus more of our attention on those negative outcomes so that we bias our ideas about what's going to make us happy. So a concrete example of this is some great research that was done by folks at University of Chicago. Nicholas Epley was the lead researcher. They caught people on their commute in Chicago. So they were going to work on the L or on the bus. And they said, can
Interesting.
you fill out our survey? And we're going to ask you to do something. And people cooperated. And what they did is they asked them about what is it like to talk to a stranger? Would you ever do that on the ride into work? And people said, oh, and there's no way they wouldn't be interested in me. I'd just rather sit by myself and zone out or listen to a podcast or something. And they said, okay, you're the 50% that we're going to randomly assign to talk to a stranger. That's what your task is. They caught them at the end of their commute as well. They asked them again about their mood. And lo and behold, the people who were encouraged to talk to a stranger reported being happier. So this is an example of how we think our affective forecasting suggests we'll be miserable talking to a stranger. It'll be anxiety provoking. They won't be interested in us. And it turns out to be a source of pleasure and connection. And we find this repeatedly in other studies. So that's an example of how our brain leads us to do things that maybe aren't in our best interest.
That is very interesting, and I gather recent learning does tell you exactly the. It's not so. It is intuitive that like a very important spousal relationship matters a lot, but days are better where you just have this strange little maybe quip with I have dogs. You go for a walk with the dogs, and you're likely to just have a 15-second little exchange that'll leave you feeling kind of happier. Though I still want to follow up here because okay, risk aversion, and that's a general theme in life, but it seems. I think it's bigger than that, and the book says it's bigger than that. So you would think risk aversion would be consistent with a view that says, I know I really want to make better connections, but I'm scared people will reject me, etc. But the self-ignorance seems more profound than that. I mean, people at least start early in their life, think they really believe that money or status or fame,
Yes. Yeah.
is the way to go, and don't place relationships anywhere near where they ought to be. Um, Do you have a sense of, so same question, but as to that, why are we
Yeah.
so lousy at knowing the importance of this dominant fact from the cradle?
Well, I think that's so important. So if we zoom out a bit more, that there's so many distractions in modern life and so many messages telling us that making money is important, being famous is important. If we scroll through social media, we see people's highly curated versions of how great their lives are, and ours feel miserable and tiny in comparison. So I think there are a lot of messages that tell us that things that are easy to count, like money, career stuff that you can put on a resume, even fame these days, where you can count your followers
Right.
online, those become distractions from us, from something we might know in our inside is really good for us, that ancient traditions may have told us is important for us, our connections to community and other people. But I think we get both misled and distracted by those messages. And it's particularly profound for young people. So I think
Mm.
the data that you were referring to about the number of people that are interested in fame, that's a high priority. These were young people responding to a survey about what's
Right.
most important in your life. It's not, a job that's meaningful. It's not relationships with others. It's fame. And second on that list was money, was the second one.
Yeah, and it is funny because you mentioned just in passing the role of comparison, which I think people understand intuitively is such a pernicious aspect of life. But it would seem if you think about it, and maybe partly as young people just don't, why do you want the money and why do you want the fame? It should have something to do with how other people, you should be able to work your way back to relationships, but people don't. I'd
But I
like to
think,
broaden a little bit the discussion of the stranger on the street and the spouse, because your finding is almost all sorts of relationships matter here. Pretty good buddies, workplace things. Can you sort of is there a taxonomy of the kinds of relationships that matter? There's some very valuable, I'm also anticipating later in our discussion, but some very valuable practical tips for what you can do to harness the learning from this study. But just to speak to that somewhat,
yeah.
what sorts of relationships matter most, and if to complicate it further, I think it also matters at life stage. At least you've correlated it with life stage and the
It
like.
does.
So
It
can we just
does.
talk about the range
Yeah.
of friendships, relationships, etc., and maybe how
Yeah.
maybe life stage as well?
So I'm going to start with the
Yeah.
basic idea, which I think we just forget. And it's not just lay people, it's psychologists. The number of things that relationships do for us is quite extraordinary, and they're quite meaningful, the benefits or functions of relationships. So we can think about when we face challenges in life, when we're really stressed out, there's a significant challenge for us. We turn to people who we care about. Many of us are lucky enough to have those folks. People help us navigate a number of ways. They help us deal with our emotions, which can be hard to sit with or hard to control under those circumstances. They point us in a direction that may help us on a path towards solving the challenge that we're facing. They correct our ideas. Mark, you're thinking about this completely wrong. You're
Yeah.
missing an important piece. So, friends play a critical role when it comes to navigating stress. Relationships are also critical for us in our sense of identity and connecting us with our past, which is important for the stories that we tell about ourselves. Friends are also, and all relationships are places that we have our strongest positive emotions as well, which are critical in their own right. And they're also critical for helping us calm down if we're stressed out. So,
And positive emotions, by that you mean?
happiness and joy and a sense of connection to other
Mhm.
people, that wonderful feeling we get when you're walking the dog and someone comes to pet the dog and you have a brief conversation. You
Yeah.
feel like you're part of a neighborhood or a community beyond yourself. So those functions, it's hard to have them served totally by one person. Some people are lucky enough to have a wonderful partner and spouse, but if you don't, there are lots of other people in your life that can provide those functions. So friends, people that you work with, neighbors, family members, siblings, parents, kids, all of that can provide those kinds of functions. So the taxonomy that we discuss in the book is more the kinds of functions and types of support that people provide. And that could be provided from all sorts of people. People find them in very creative ways in their life. most important thing probably for all of us is someone who really has our back. That's what we
Yeah.
mean by a close connection. So in our study, we asked people if you were scared or sick in the middle of the night, who would you call? And some people are able to list a bunch. And some people, even though their partner might be sitting right next to them, they said nobody. I'm on my own when it comes to that. So
This is
that
very useful, by
feeling,
the way. So just, God, I'd like to talk for 5 hours, but
yeah.
very quickly, I'm in the study, and let's just say, tell me a little bit about, you're going to come talk to me for like hours, right? And it's how frequently and whatever.
Yeah.
So just give a little bit about the in-depth look at individuals.
So over the 85 years, questionnaires came about every 2 or 3 years, interviews probably about every 10 years on average. And the interviews were long. We'd go to visit people, we'd sit in their homes, we'd kind of look around and get a sense of what their life was like. There were often communications that went outside of that as well. So the study was really good. Again, in the beginning of the study and the middle part of the study, long before I was involved, it was really good about engaging people. So the participants often look forward to these interviews, even though they asked tough questions. They felt known and appreciated. For the Harvard students, we often talk about they just assume that everyone want to know about them, so it was kind of natural. And then the inner city kids, this was a kind of point of pride to be part of the study. So we had, I think it's close to 83% participation of the original participants through their lifetime. They were really engaged. So if you were a part of the study, you would be asked to fill out questionnaires, and the questionnaires went on for 10 pages. Sometimes it would take you a while to fill out. Interviews, oftentimes we'd come to you, sometimes we conduct them by the phone. And in more recent times, we're asking people to come into the lab so we can do things like do brain scans of what's happening in their brains, collect blood so we can understand their immune functioning, their levels of inflammation, stress them out as well. So our participants are pretty good spirited about the kinds of questions. More recently, we asked them to tell us about the lowest moment in your life, to write
Yeah.
about it. And then we asked some questions about that moment. So tough questions, and participants are, I would say, highly motivated. Also worth saying that the children of the original participants, more than 2/3 of them said, yes, I'll participate in that study that my mom and dad have been part of. I'd be honored to be a part of it. So there's
Wow.
good rapport here.
Yeah, and it's almost like having, I don't know, therapy, or throughout your life being able to get a vantage point, just reflect on who you are. I was struck in the 7 Up movies. Some of them actually they've had enough, and they leave. Let me just quickly, because you mentioned again the Harvard kids and the inner city kids. Did you find, and I know, kind of like 7 Up, that I think theme quickly receded in the study in favor of just the endless fascination of individuals. But were there meaningful differences in the level of, I'll say, eudaimonia, for lack of a better term, among the privileged and underprivileged cohorts?
So I'm going to talk first about differences, and
Yeah.
the kids who grew up from the inner city sample made less money, accumulated less wealth than the Harvard students. That's what we would expect. They died at an earlier age, so on average, they died 10 years earlier than the Harvard
Wow,
students. So that's
10 years
quite a
earlier.
large gap. And
Wow.
that's consistent with lots of evidence about the effects
Yes.
of poverty and
Mhm.
lack of
Mhm.
education, right? I mean, it's a significant disparity. When we look at the outcomes that we're interested in, both the sense of satisfaction or meaning in life and happiness, we don't see differences. And equally important in our study and across many other studies, the benefits of social connection appear to transcend the context that you grew up in, whether it's deprivation or privilege, the culture you come from, that social connection helps across all of those divides, which is quite unusual. Now, it may help in on the surface of it. Social connection may look different in a particular culture than another. For example, maybe the Harvard men were more eager to talk about their inner experience because they were raised to do that, and Harvard somehow trained them that they were important.
Yeah.
But the ways that they engaged in connection and the importance of that connection more critically appears to be important for both cohorts. And this is true again across study after study. So in the book, we talk about a study that looked at a bunch of different studies. And it is true that if you grew up in rural Georgia and you were Black in particular, your life expectancy was lower than if you grew up in Finland. But the benefits of social connection are apparent in both of those settings, which are very different. So that's why the simple message that we
So on the
talk.
bottom line to the question is basically equivalent in terms of, is that right? Because,
Yeah. So
I mean, and we
that's
might posit that the feudal 14th century, for whatever, it's a kind of hedonic baseline that if it's driven by relationships, you can be very rich in relationships and poor otherwise.
and they're important no matter
Yeah.
what. And again, the context may be very different, but they're important. And that probably goes back long before the feudal
Yeah.
period, right? It goes back to our evolutionary origins. It made sense that we were social creatures. That's how we survived. And we carry that into the 21st century as well.
Gotcha. Let me ask you, I wouldn't say personal as much as just driven by my life circumstances. So I think you found overall, at least there were anecdotal, you asked this question and anecdotally, there seemed to be a pretty strong congruence between how people rated their life of relationships, their overall satisfaction, and say age 50, and then much older. And so the thing that strikes me about that time is it's a period when friends die. Mm-hmm. And I think it's just a fact. We're going to talk more about specific strategies that you proffer, but I think it's just a fact that it's really hard to recreate friendships that often, came about when you were younger and just hanging out a long time once you get older. So is it the case that you find overall people, it's not simply the objective list of friendships and kinds of friendships, but almost a kind of metabolic, adjustment that you make such that the 50-year-old and the 75-year-old are kind of similar? Or, if not, then what specific kinds of challenges of loneliness do even well-adjusted people face as friends fall away?
So one of the remarkable findings, I think, in modern psychology is, first of all, the prevalence of loneliness. We're talking in the United States, depending on the survey, 20 to 50% report loneliness, which is extraordinary.
Including a lot of young people, right?
And that's the amazing thing that I was going to talk about, right? So there are two groups that are at most.
Yeah.
There are two groups that are at highest risk for loneliness. It's young people and older people. And young people are particularly interesting in this way because we're talking about college students in particular who report high rates of loneliness and yet are in close proximity to thousands of people that are like them, that are pursuing similar goals.
So quick apology for the lapping sound of the dog.
But that's okay. It's nice to see the dog that connects you with him.
Where do you see this dog, by the way? Anyway, go ahead.
So, they live in close proximity to others, but inside what they experience is a sense that other people don't know them or don't care about them, that they don't have their back. Older people, it's different, that older people are physically more limited, so they can be socially isolated. So as a society, we need to reckon with that and to figure out ways to solve this, because it's a major public health problem. It's a public health problem because not only is it prevalent, but the risk associated with loneliness is on the same order as the risk that we associate with obesity and with smoking a pack of cigarettes. This is the risk for physical illness or for death. So we're talking about a very serious public health problem.
Statistically, it's about that increment, you're saying?
Exactly. The risk associated with being lonely is so corrosive to our health that it's very similar to the effect of smoking and obesity. So with older people, something interesting happens. As we go from midlife to late life, people generally tend to get happier. It's not a major increase in happiness. I've read this a lot, but they get a little bit happier. And we think that's probably because of a kind of emotional wisdom that people accumulate as they age, that they realize they need to maximize what they can get from their connections that give them joy and vitality. And they kind of double down and lean into those relationships. And people do that normatively across the group of people aging. This is what happens. So Networks shrink, people die. It's very hard to lose an age-old friend, but older people are good at using the relationships that exist. Those kinds of losses that you're talking about are very painful. As I watch my parents age, they're still around. Their friends dying is one of the most significant losses, and it's a loss not just for their current existence. These are people that they have spent lifetimes with. They have connections. So it's a part of their identity and where they came from. So very hard to deal with, but older people have this ability that they accumulate through life. And it is, I think, an emotional wisdom that counters the shrinking of that network in ways that are quite extraordinary.
So, an interesting and useful part of the book is, in addition to all the fascinating findings, and particularly, I mean, I think it's really engrossing on two levels. One, just thinking about the whole lesson sort of abstracted, but then you have just I'm sure you curated them carefully for the book, but very interesting, specific anecdotes.
Stories. Yeah.
The rich guy who finds out he's not so happy, and the guy who becomes a public school teacher. Anyway, I commend to everyone the book for those stories. But there's a lot of the book that is, for lack of a better word, kind of a how-to part, and not something you see appended to the studies you talked about before. But you give a pep talk to a lot of readers about how they needn't settle for their own perceived limitations in this most important part of life. There are things really to be done. And I wonder if you could talk about some of those.
Yeah. So, I mean, first, I want to say the book is really aimed at people across the age spectrum. So, we're trying hard to address the differences across the age spectrum, but also being sensitive to things that people can do regardless of their situation. So, when we shopped this book, I learned something about the publishing industry. They said, well, is this self help? Is it prescriptive self help? And we said, no, we don't really think so. And we said it's more kind of reflective self help. And that's how we think about it, that we're urging people to do something similar to, I think, what you were raising. The participants had this benefit of these check ins at least every 2 years. They told us that they were valuable. They liked talking a little bit about their experience and reflecting on their life. So the exercises that we talk about are really kind of reflections on what we talk about as social fitness. That just like our physical fitness, we really need to think about our social connections as something we need to work on. Otherwise, they wither. So they're exercises that first are intended to have you reflect on your experiences. So who in your life are you having frequent connections with, and you're finding those invigorating and satisfying? They make you feel human and connected. First, to map out those people and how frequently you see them. If there are people in your life that you have that feeling with, they're invigorating and enjoy being with, but you don't get to see them frequently, can you figure out strategies to spend more time with them? And the first step is always reaching out and letting them know, Harry, I enjoy this conversation. Could we do it again? Could we find another time? So trying to ride against that wave that's distracting us, that's pulling our attention, social media, our phone, all the technologies that we're surrounded with. And then you also want to think about the challenges in your life in terms of relationships. Are there people, maybe it's a sibling that you've lost touch with, or a friend that you had an argument with 5 years ago and you haven't been able to figure out how to repair that? If these people are important enough to you, are you willing, are you able to, are you brave enough to reach out and say, I miss where we used to be. Could we get on the phone? Could we go for a walk? Maybe start with a text. I'm thinking about you. I miss the conversations that we used to have. So there's lots of advice there about ways to begin those conversations and ways to also navigate those challenges that create emotions that make it hard for us to move forward. And part of it is just leaning in and sitting with those emotions. And there hopefully some good advice in the book about how to do that as well.
I mean, for sure there is. And interestingly, I don't know if other people experience this, but during COVID, for some reason, I was moved to do just that, but including to, college buddies and the like. And almost without fail, they were at a minimum delightful, just for sort of, hearkening back. But a sort of follow up there, Mark, is you're suggesting that the value, the emotional value, the eudaimonic value of these relationships are kind of correlates with time you need to be spending and curating, etc. But the thing you've described as most valuable is this sense of feeling protected. So I have a lot of friends personally. I don't live near them anymore. I don't talk to them anymore, but I know they have my back if
Yep.
and when I need them. And there is some real sort of value there.
Yep.
But so how do you kind of, balance on the one hand I feel, they're in my corner when the time comes versus just the sort of aggregate of we bowl together every week.
I think both of those things are important. And, when you look at least traditional studies of whether there's any gender influence on connections, it's often men who will talk about, well, my best friend, I haven't talked to them for months,
Yeah.
maybe even years, but I know when the stuff hits the fan that they're going to be there for me, that they'll be in my corner. So this is interesting. I think gender differences have really shrunk even in friendships over the years. But we can have different kinds of friends. So we can have friends that we do regularly connect with, or we text about things that are happening in our life. Friends that we might see only a few years, but they know that they're important to us. And I think all of those things are important. I found it really interesting, Harry, the example you gave, and I think a lot of us did, and I did it too during the beginning of the pandemic.
Yeah.
There was this sense that we were quite vulnerable, that we didn't know what was going to happen. Some of us could get sick with this illness that we didn't know how bad or dangerous it was, and it was very dangerous in the beginning. And we reach out for that kind of protection that you're talking about when we're faced with the prospect of death. And that's part of what compels older people, we think, is there's a time limit that they're recognizing in their life, and they want to remake those connections to kind of pull the energy from them. And we also find a sense of security in that protective blanket that close relationships provide. So it's not just about frequency, it's also about the stuff you get from that relationship. And part of what we can get too, which is fun to think about, it's not just the engagement with that person, but it's the image of that person, right, that we hold. So if I think about my friends from college or from
Yeah.
childhood that I'm still closely connected with, I just start to smile about certain shared
Exactly.
experience. I don't even need to be with them, right?
So goofy them, they show themselves. Yeah.
So there's so many parts of it. Frequency is only one piece, but this is part of the argument in the book. We talk about
Yeah.
work being an important place of connection. And that's because we spend so much of our waking hours, many of us, at work. So we want to think about ways at work to also be seen and heard and recognized by other people as well. And I think that's important for work environments as well. People who get to have a say about what those environments are like. We want to model those kinds of connections and work environments that provide those connections as well, just because of the amount of time we spend in them.
You mentioned just now, kind of in passing, gender differences and how they've narrowed. I wonder if you mean that in terms of style of friendships and relationships, because an interesting part of the book is you kind of catalog how would you put it? Maybe the value that men and women derive from different relationships. I wonder if you could speak to that some. And the lessons seem equally applicable, but maybe in slightly different, with the details a little bit different. Can you elaborate?
I think the critical take home when you look carefully at the literature, which we did on gender differences in friendships, is that if there are differences, they're really small, which really means that men and women overlap much more than there are differences. But at the extreme ends, we all know men that, say they're never going to talk to anyone. I have a relative who at the beginning of COVID said, this is the challenge that's made for me because I don't like spending time with people. I'm going to be all alone and it sounds great. Now, of course, things were a little different than he expected. But we have on the extremes some differences, and some of those differences manifest in the way we do relationships. So the traditional way of thinking about this is that men do best in kind of parallel activities with others. So walking, playing sports together, playing cards, doing something as opposed to face-to-face. Women do best face-to-face and may desire more frequency in their connections with others. I think those relationships, those gender differences are waning, that we're becoming more and more alike. The men in our study were born in the 30s, so we worked very hard to compare 20s and 30s. We worked very hard to compare, the findings that we had with modern studies. And what you find, particularly during adolescence, are boys growing up having these very intimate conversations with their partners. Maybe they start to wane a bit, the degree of intimacy, as they get into early adulthood. And that probably is because of societal forces that still say being masculine means being independent and not talking as much about your feelings. So there's still some of those pressures, But the very idea of gender, the ways in which gender is socializing and influencing people, it's gotten, way more open and diverse. So kind of interesting to watch what happens as we move forward, I think.
But men still won't ask strangers for directions.
Yeah, yeah.
Let me sort of we're near out of time, but I want to you give a very hopeful message, not simply for everybody. And the exercises you began to discuss, we all could do. They're pretty straightforward. And I actually did a few of them just in reading the book, and I think there's value to them, period. But I wanted to zero in at the end on, people, there are a lot of people, maybe even more than it should be, who really feel like, I just didn't draw a good hand here. And, I know it's so important, but it's really, I'm going to have to, face a decrement in this most of all important of categories. You find that that's not so. You find really cause for hope, even in people who think of themselves as socially awkward, not good at relationships, etc. I wonder if you could speak a little bit to that, including in concrete ways with people that come to your mind. From the study.
So important. So thank you, Harry, for raising it. So I think what I want to say, because you said something was not true, what I want to say is true, is that there are a lot of folks out there that feel like they've been dealt a bad hand, that they're lonely and they've had difficulties in their relationships. Maybe it's because of their genetics or their early experience or because of some challenge they've had in life. So I want to speak to those people, and we worked hard in the book to speak to them. We have a chapter at the end that's called It's Never Too Late. And I'm going to, if I can, Harry, just tell a quick story about someone we feature in that chapter. So this is a man who we call Andrew Deering, and he was one of the loneliest men in the study. So across his entire adult life, he was in a marriage that was pretty miserable for him. He didn't feel connected, so he felt alone, even in the context of marriage. He had no friends. When we asked him about friends, he said really no one or zero. He loved his work. He did very intricate work with his hands that became difficult to do in his 60s, and he had to retire. At the same time, he left his wife finally. And one of the things he did is he joined a gym, mainly because he was worried about aging and his physical health. But he figured out that there were people there every morning that he recognized after a time. He saw their faces and they would kind of nod to each other and they'd started to have conversations. And this is how we make friendships. We have repeated contact with people across time. And he started talking about his interest in old movies. And sure enough, these young folks were even interested in his interest in old movies. And he'd have people over for movie screenings. So in his 70s, so this is a man through his 60s, was miserable and lonely. In his 70s, when the study followed up and interviewed him, Andrew, do you have friends? Looking at the old responses, expecting zero, he said, several is his simple response. So this is a story of hope. It's a story we see repeated, that as you study people across their adult life, there's more change than we would ever expect. Some of it is serendipitous. He went to the gym and he got friends, which was great. Some of it is more intentional. We change our roles. He did retire, right? So he was changing his role in life. And those are opportunities to think about leaning in and making new connections. And we need to get out of the house. It's really important. We need to be side by side with people doing things, really critical. That's how friendships develop. And that's how Andrew developed his friends.
The book is The Good Life. I'm not sure how to categorize it either, because it's both fascinating sociology, but very, very practical how-to. I should give a mention to Marc's co-author, Robert Waldindger, on that. And just thanks very much for being with us today. It's also a super interesting read, just all the kinds of life stories that you've selected. Anyway, thanks for the book. Thanks for your time.
Thank you, Harry. Such a pleasure to talk to you. Appreciate it.
Thanks for tuning in. If you enjoyed this video and other Talking Feds content, please take a second to like and subscribe. Talk to you later.